How I survived an abusive marriage and won custody of my son. When I met Ethan, he seemed perfect. We were in our early 20s. And like many women who are young and hopeful, I was eager to build a future with someone who could make me feel safe and loved. Ethan was charismatic, a smooth talker, and knew just the right things to say to make me believe that he was the man I had been searching for. But, as it often goes with relationships that take a darker turn, what I didn't see was the part of him that would slowly come to dominate my life, a part of him that was anything but loving. I remember the early days with him vividly. He had this way of making me feel like the center of the universe. Like no one else mattered but us. I was blinded by it. Captivated by his charm and the way he could light up a room. My family and friends didn't share my enthusiasm, though they sensed something wasn't right about Ethan long before I did. But I was young, stubborn, and in love, or what I thought was love. I brushed off their concerns, convinced that they just didn't know him the way I did. I thought I was different, that I could bring out the best in him. The first sign of trouble came a few months into our marriage. It was small at first. Just a flash of anger here and there over things that didn't matter. A misplaced set of keys. A meal that wasn't to his liking. Or even the way I laughed too loudly at a joke. His temper was quick and sharp, but it always blew over just as quickly. And in those early days, he was apologetic afterward. He'd tell me he was stressed from work or that he didn't mean it. And I'd forgive him because I believed him. The apologies always came with promises that things would get better. That he'd change. That he'd never hurt me again. And I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But things didn't get better. They got worse. The turning point came the day I found out I was pregnant. It was supposed to be a joyful moment. Something that would bring us closer together. But instead of the happiness I had hoped for, Ethan's behavior became erratic. He would disappear for hours. Sometimes days. Without any explanation. When he was home, he was either distant or angry. Like he resented me for carrying our child. The verbal abuse intensified. And though he never laid a hand on me during those months, I could feel the tension building between us. A storm brewing just beneath the surface. When our son, Jackson, was born, I thought things would change. I thought becoming a father would soften Ethan. That the sight of his newborn son would melt whatever anger he harbored inside him. For a brief moment, I saw hope in his eyes as he held Jackson for the first time. But that moment was fleeting. And it wasn't long before the darkness in him resurfaced. Ethan's temper became a constant presence in our home. What started as verbal outbursts soon escalated to physical violence. It wasn't every day. Not at first. But the episodes became more frequent as time passed. He would shove me. Grab my arm hard enough to leave bruises. Throw things across the room in a rage. And I endured it all because I didn't know how to leave. I felt trapped. Isolated. And ashamed that I had allowed my life to spiral out of control. The worst part wasn't the pain he inflicted on me, it was the fear that Jackson would grow up in a household where violence was normal. Where he would learn to accept it or, worse, become like his father. I had to protect him. But I didn't know how. Every time I thought about leaving, Ethan would find a way to manipulate me into staying. He'd apologize. Promise that he'd get help. That he'd change for the sake of our son. But deep down, I knew he never would. It wasn't until the night he was arrested that I finally saw a way out. Ethan had come home drunk after one of his many unexplained disappearances. I knew right away that something was different. His anger that night was explosive. More violent than I had ever seen before. He hurled accusations at me. Irrational things that didn't make sense. And when I tried to calm him down, he struck me. Hard. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think my body went into shock. Numb from the realization that this wasn't just another one of his outbursts. This was something more. I remember hearing the sirens outside. Seeing the flashing lights through the window. The neighbors had called the police after hearing the commotion. And just like that, Ethan was gone, handcuffed and taken away while Jackson slept in his crib, blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding him. In the days that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. Ethan's arrest should have brought relief. But instead, it brought a new kind of nightmare: his family. From the moment they found out he had been arrested, they came after me with everything they had. They blamed me for his downfall, accused me of ruining their son's life. But the worst part was when they threatened to take Jackson from me. They claimed that I was an unfit mother, that I couldn't possibly provide for my son without Ethan. It was as if the universe was conspiring against me, throwing one obstacle after another in my path. I had fought so hard to protect Jackson from his father's abuse, only to face the possibility of losing him to the very people who had enabled Ethan's behavior for years. Ethan's parents were relentless. They filed for custody, using their money and influence to drag me through a brutal legal battle. They painted me as unstable, unfit to raise a child, while they portrayed themselves as the loving, stable grandparents who only wanted what was best for Jackson. It didn't matter to them that their son had been violent, that I had the bruises to prove it. In their eyes, I was the villain, and they were the saviors. I was alone, with no one to turn to. My own family had distanced themselves from me after I married Ethan, and my friends had long since drifted away. It was just me and Jackson, fighting against the weight of Ethan's family's power and influence. I couldn't afford a lawyer, but I couldn't afford to lose my son either. So I fought. I fought with everything I had, even when it felt like I was drowning, even when it felt like there was no hope left. The legal battle dragged on for months, a seemingly endless cycle of court dates, accusations, and counter-accusations. Every time I thought I had made progress, Ethan's family would come back with something else. Another lie, another way to tear me down. But I refused to give up. I had to stay strong, not just for myself, but for Jackson. He was my world, and I couldn't let them take him away from me. There were moments when I thought I would lose, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. But in those moments, I would look at Jackson, at his innocent face, and I would find the strength to keep going. I couldn't let him grow up thinking that his mother had failed him, that she hadn't fought hard enough to keep him safe. In the end, it wasn't the legal system that saved me, it was the truth. The truth about Ethan's abuse, about the fear I had lived in for so long. The courts finally saw through the lies, and Ethan's parents' attempts to discredit me began to crumble. They had built their case on a foundation of falsehoods, and in the end, that foundation collapsed. The day the judge ruled in my favor was one of the most emotional days of my life. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, just relief that Jackson was safe, that he would grow up in a home where he was loved and protected. But there was also sadness, a lingering sorrow for the life I had lost, for the years I had spent trapped in a cycle of abuse and fear. I look at Jackson now, and I see hope. He is my light, my reason for fighting. He will never know the full extent of what I went through to protect him, and for that, I am grateful. I don't want him to carry the weight of the past. He deserves better than that. He deserves a life free from the darkness that once threatened to consume us both. And as for Ethan, I don't know what became of him. After his arrest and the subsequent custody battle, he disappeared from our lives. I haven't heard from him in years, and I don't care to. Jackson doesn't ask about him, and I don't offer any explanations. He has no need for a father who was never there for him. We've built a life for ourselves, Jackson and I. It hasn't been easy, but we've made it. And in the quiet moments, when I watch him play or sleep, I remind myself that I did the right thing. I fought for him, and I won. And in the end, that's all that matters.